Oh, hello and welcome. My name is Amelia Larson, and I serve as the Executive Vice President of Innovations and Academic Partnerships at American Reading Company. We will be recording today's sessions, and you will receive an email with the link to the recording, along with information regarding our upcoming webinars. Please feel free to submit your comments and questions in the chat box. We will be monitoring the conversation, and we'll have a question and answer session at the end. If you are on social media today, remember to use the hashtag ArcLearns as you share your learning with others. It is our great pleasure to introduce you and welcome back Dr. Alfred Tatum, Dr. Jeff Wilhelm, and Ron Walker for our conversation today. Dr. Tatum is a literacy professor and the director of the University of Illinois at Chicago Reading Clinic. He is the author of several books, including Reading for Their Life, Building the Textual Lineages of African Adolescent Males, and Fearless Voices, Engaging a New Generation of African American Adolescent Male Writers. Dr. Jeffrey Wilhelm is a distinguished professor of English education at Boise State University, and he's the founding director of the Maine and Boise State Writing Projects. He's the author of and co-author of over 40 books about literacy teaching and learning, and his most recent publication is Planning Powerful Instruction: 7 Must-Make Moves to Transform How We Teach and How Students Learn. Ron Walker is the founding executive director of the Coalition of Schools Educating Boys of Color, COSABOC, and he's also a former associate director of Atlas Community, a comprehensive school reform organization working with more than 100 schools across the country in urban, suburban, and rural school districts. He's the author of the book, Solomon's Plan, A Gift of Education from a Father to His Son. And you're going to hear some of this, you're going to hear him reading some of the pages in this book. Together, these 3 gentlemen bring over 100 years of educational experience, passion for the affirmative development of all students, especially male students of color, along with knowledge and inspiration. And that's what we need right now. We are at a critical moment to get this right, to do something powerful and significant to advance critical literacy for our youth, for our male youth of color. Our time is short, only 60 minutes, but prepare to be blown away and leverage the moonshot mindset that can bring the literacy victory we have been waiting for in this country. With that, I'll pass it on to Ron Walker.
Thank you, Amelia, and welcome to everyone who's on the webinar today. I'm super excited for this hour. It's going to be a power hour. And so you're going to be receiving a lot of pearls of wisdom from these 2 gentlemen who I call them the educators for liberation, education for literacy education as well. And I've had a good fortune of meeting both of them. I know Dr. Tatum for quite a while, and Jeffrey and I serve on the ARC board together. So let me just tell you a little bit about why literacy and why this is so important to me on a personal story. First of all, it is personal because if it were not for 2 parents, both from the Jim Crow South, I probably would not be here doing what I'm doing today. And in this day and age of vaccinations for COVID, as we all know, we're all sheltering in place and doing Zoom on a regular basis. But the vaccination is going to be really important to help us defeat this disease. Let me just tell you, I was vaccinated very early in my life. And I'm not talking about the COVID vaccine because it wasn't existing at that time. I'm not talking about the polio vaccine. I'm not talking about chickenpox. I'm not talking about mumps. But I was vaccinated on a nightly basis by a mother who loved to read. And she vaccinated me with the vaccine of cultural appreciation. And in that vaccine, you know, one night she dosed me and gave me a shot of Langston Hughes. One night she gave me a shot of Gwendolyn Brooks. Another night it was Paul Lawrence Dunbar. But every night I was receiving a dosage of this vaccine. And because as a little boy, I was wondering why she was nightly reciting mother to son, well, son, life ain't no crystal state. I couldn't get it at that particular time. But little did I know she was preparing me. Now, on the flip side, my father, who you'll hear more about him a little later, Solomon Walker, could not read, could not write. Both my parents were from the Jim Crow South, and they both came north in the Great Black Migration. And so my father, while he couldn't read or write, his was a verbal testimony. His was an oral narrative. And, he was someone who understood what it meant to be in the world. And he inoculated with me with the importance of building relationships. And so as life went on, later on, I finally got it as I was going to high school and going to college, that my immune system could ward off these attacks when anyone would try to think that I'm less than or unable to, or not have the ability to take on a project. I would fall back on Mother to Son, recited by my mother. I would fall back on Elaine Locke and the Harlem Renaissance. I would fall back on my study of Frederick Douglass, on what it means to be free. And so I was, immuned up, by these vaccinations. So I say that because it led me to realize that as a teacher, as a principal, there were too many of our boys and young men, Black and brown, who were not inoculated in the way I was. And so it became my charge, my mission, to be able to say, what can I do? And that what can I do led me to forming the Coalition of Schools Educating Boys of Color. And around about that same time is when I saw a little article in Ed Week, and it had the name of a person who wrote a book called Teaching Black Boys to Read. His name was Dr. Alfred Tatum. And Alfred, if you remember, I called you up and said, hey, how about doing a little something together as I'm beginning to launch this initiative? And thankfully, he said yes. And Dr. Tatum has been a keynote speaker for us on a couple of occasions. And little does he know I'm going to call him soon on something else. Right. It's because of that kind of past inoculation and vaccination that led me to really appreciate the power of reading. And moreover, the power of writing. Literacy matters. So that's a little bit about me. And I'd like to open up first, Dr. Tatum, with a question to you. And then Jeff, if you would follow up after Dr. Tatum responds to questions. How do we restore? And I know you've wrote a lot about textual lineages and empowering and enabling books, but let me just start here. How do we restore African-American boys to have that confidence to be able to read, to write, and speak as tools of their protection? What do we do? I mean, how do we restore it? Because right now we're going through a sheltering place, a pandemic. So what say you?
Hey, thanks, Ron, for that powerful introduction. I like to build on what you just said. Going to restore their confidence, we first have to autopsy their relationships with literacy, their relationships with text, and their relationship with their own identity. You just gave us a powerful personal autopsy, and that's how I began to look at it. But I'll frame it this way. In my experiences, if you do three things, if you are very intentional about creating an early intellectual architecture or infrastructure, it goes a long way with young boys. I'll say a little bit more about that. The challenge is, however, there is a poverty or even paucity of Black intellectual production. When you talked about your mother, you were talking about intellectual production. If we don't remove ourselves from that poverty or that paucity, that becomes problematic. And the third thing that's most important, we have to remove the stigma of talking about moving young boys to advanced levels of literacy development. That becomes a taboo subject. Oftentimes when we talk about advanced literacy, it's grounded in the notion of whiteness. You and I both know, as members of Black Greek level fraternities, those founders were engineers, they were architects, they were physicians. But for whatever reason, our young boys are suffering from an underexposure to text. We're not conceptualizing in the right way, and that's going to be critical. I'll give you a practical example. Working with a group of young boys, I said, we're just going to focus on regression analysis. Teachers were saying, why are you having elementary kids focus on regression analysis? Because there's so much language that says Black boys are more likely to. But they don't have the language, the tools, or the text to fight back with, or to restore or think about their own level of confidence. And so I started asking kids, well, who's most likely to get a cavity? I didn't go really deep. And then I said, who's most likely to be misjudged? Who's most likely to own land? But you now see that I can offer them text, sociological text, agricultural text, mathematics text, but they were absolutely motivated and engaged by the idea that I'm becoming brilliant about this thing called regression analysis. It's something very basic that you do in Excel, and then I put the text in front of them. And so the question is, how do we create a strong foundation in a way that pays attention to a long-term trajectory that stokes both social and scientific consciousness? So when we autopsy and think about our own inoculations, we could look back and say that we did all we can with the text that we have to make sure that we pay attention to their intellectual and human development.
Thank you.
Powerful, Alfred, powerful. Now, Jeff, why don't you, what say you about that same question, Jeff, in terms of building confidence in one's, in particular, Black and brown boys' ability to read, to write, to speak, to think?
Well, first of all, let me acknowledge and thank Ron and Dr. Tatum for including me in this conversation. They've been great teachers and thinking partners to me over many years, and I have very many fond memories of presenting with Dr. Tatum in various venues when we were both doing research on young men in the early aughts. So very, very glad to be here. I think a missing topic of conversation is what we call engagement. And engagement is often considered the hook into something, but theories of engagement describe this concept as everything you do to hook in and then make meaning with the text or problem at hand. Now, Dr. Tatum said boys are suffering, and that's been true over the last 30, 40 years. The data in every state of America, in every province of Canada, every state of Australia, and in 49 countries where data is available show that boys underachieve girls in every area of literacy to a statistically significant degree, with the one exception of workplace literacy. Now, as a teacher, that's very interesting in its accumulated detail. And of course, you look at the issue of boys, and the situation has not improved over the last 30, 40 years, although we know about it. Like I said, it's compelling in its detail. Now, that's interesting, but it doesn't answer my questions as a teacher, which is, why is this the case? And what can we do about it? Mm-hmm. And I think engagement is the answer here, or one of the answers. When I did my research, Reading Don't Fix No Chevys, with Michael Smith from Temple University, one of the things that really stood out to us was the impatience of BIPOC learners and kids in poverty with traditional schooling, with what Martin Haberman calls the pedagogy of poverty, because they did not immediately see the purpose and payoff. And they understood the challenges facing them. Seeing the purpose and payoff for themselves and for their class, the wider community, was absolutely essential to them. You know, one of the interesting things was I was collecting data at two sites, and Michael was analyzing my data, you know, and he was collecting data at two sites, and I was analyzing his data. And I was at a private school, and I said to Michael, I got 2 scholarship boys. What do you think? You know, these were kids of color who were also in poverty in Baltimore City. And he immediately picked them out. And I go, how'd you pick them out? And he said, they're not getting what they need. And they're very, very impatient. You know, not getting what you need when you need it is an issue of what's called educational equity, which I think we need to pay a lot more attention to. equality means everybody gets the same thing. As Jeffrey Andrade likes to say, that's simple math, and we don't even get that right. Equity is everybody getting what they need when they need it. And if learners struggle in any way with getting hooked, or with being inducted into expertise, or with full participation in applying what they've learned, then they must get what they need when they need it. So we need to take up topics and inquiries that matter in the here and the now to the kids, and also that we're edgy. One of the African-American boys in our study, he said to us, I don't want to read about slavery. It's too dry. It misses the edge, but I want to read about slave narratives. I want to read the story of a real slave that has the edginess. And this is something you hear boys talk about in school all the time, that we're missing the edge. We're missing what's most compelling. One boy said, school takes twisty twirly ice cream with sprinkles on top and turns it pure vanilla. That we're missing the thing that would drive us, that's compelling to us. I'll conclude by just saying that, President Obama's first chief of staff was Rahm Emanuel, and he was fond of saying, never let a good crisis go to waste. And I think that's something we have to ask right now. Where to now? Our new president yesterday articulated 6 crises, climate, racial equity, income inequality. There's never been a better time for teaching in ways that help all our students develop citizenship perspectives that are inclusive, fair, and welcoming to themselves and people different from themselves. And that's something that Dr. Tatum and I are going to talk about later in this webinar.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
So, Amelia, I think the ball is going to be tossed to you. I know I want to plant a seed for maybe when we come back, and that is because Jeff just triggered something about, and both Jeff and Alfred triggered something within me in terms of engagement. This reality that hip hop pedagogy and hip hop plays a big role in the life of young people, particularly young men, but not excluding young women as well. And I like to have both gentlemen circle back to that at some point, Amelia. But let me pass the ball to you.
Yeah, and so maybe we can even pick it up here, because I was going to ask Dr. Tatum to talk a little bit about textual lineage. If you can remind people of what it is and why is it so crucial during this time of multiple pandemics?
One of the things that has become so prominent as we look at our current times is we look at the intergenerational connection. Parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, aunts and uncles, because we're all forced to stay in. But there is an intergenerational relationship with text. So if you think about what Ron said earlier, mother to son, he didn't know Langston Hughes, but he knew Langston Hughes. Langston Hughes became part of his textual lineage. So these are books or materials that cause you to be, do, or think differently as a result of what you read. So if you think about a family tree and a family lineage, we have to make sure that anyone who crosses our thresholds as educators build a strong relationship with text. Because this historical foundation not only helps shape their human development, but it shapes their writing. It shapes their thinking. It shapes how they think about the next level of advancement. And so I'm sure that there are many on the call who can recite text. And we saw it yesterday. We have a nation with the textual lineage. There were so many texts that were cited, whether it's the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. I remember reading the words of W.E.B. Du Bois. I can cite these on demand. I remember reading the poem Invictus. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. For those who focus on religion, they go to the book of Job. How do you manage to survive tumultuous times? Well, we're living in tumultuous times. But the sad reality is, if we miss the mark by only paying attention to students' cultural identities, we may be focused on their social lineages, but not their scientific lineages. We are living in a world where we are yet to have an African-American who wins a Nobel Prize in science. That's our fault. It's not the fault of the young men and the young women. And it's not that we can't do science extremely well, but we're robbed of those texts and those opportunities that shape that long-term trajectory. So how do we make sure that we're paying attention to their sociological lineages and their scientific lineages? And it was the absence of the scientific lineages that led to this reemergence of STEAM in society because we were missing the mark as a nation.
Wow, lots to think about it. I know that you, Dr. Wilhelm, had some thoughts, and I'm going to share the screen because I know you have prepared a couple of slides on this. So I am going, can you see my screen?
I can.
All right, so take it.
Yeah, thanks so much, Amelia, and thank you so much, Dr. Tatum. You know, textual lineages, it seemed to me, require one to inquire into one's own identity, your place in the world, the possibilities and possible selves for yourself and for others. You know, Erik Erikson very famously said that staking identity is the overarching project of adolescence. And he identified one of those stages as identity versus role confusion. One of the things we found in our reading Don't Fix No Chevys and Go with the Flow studies was that literacy that didn't help the boys stake their identity was rejected. And also there was another little wrinkle, which was there was a continuum of acceptance to resistance as crucial to identity staking. And the boys, when they read something, they wanted to be able to decide themselves, to what degree do I embrace this? Do I want to adapt it? Do I want to reject it or resist it? And they contrasted this with playing, what one boy said, playing guess what the teacher already knows or thinks. So there was a real desire to stake your identity, and resistance was part of that. And so it seems to me there's a lot of possibilities for helping kids develop textual identities and textual lineages, not just through embracing text that are enabling for them, as Dr. Tatum has so convincingly argued, but also through resisting text and learning how to resist. One of the interesting things from literary theory is Kenneth Burke's parlor metaphor, where he says, whenever you read, you're entering this conversation, you come in to a room and there's people arguing about these topics, and you sit there and you try to figure out, what the tenor of the conversation is. Then you put in your oar and somebody rejects that and somebody embraces you, and then you have to leave. And he says, this is what literacy is about. It's about you enter into these conversations that matter to you, but also to the culture that you're living in. And it helps you ask questions like, what makes me me? And what role does literacy play in who I am and who I will become? What am I learning about myself as a literate person, as a social agent, as an ally? Another point I'd like to make is that in our study, that a lot of the boys, we had boys from across the country, different ethnicities, different social classes, and 1/3 were high achievers in literacy, and there were many who were highly adept at literacy. And then 1/3 was kind of from the great middle, and 1/3 were kids who were struggling. And one of the things that was interesting is about the kids who were struggling was they weren't struggling in all areas of their lives. There were ways always in which they were highly competent and highly adept. A lot of those kids who the teachers identified as lower achievers or struggling, one of the things that was true about them is they said, we don't like to read. And yet when we followed them and shadowed them and had them keep daily logs, they were reading all kinds of things like websites, or they were doing church talks, or they were beating and rapping, or they were writing lyrics to songs or listening to them and repeating them. There was one boy who was really big into photography and memes and visual literacy. So it makes me wonder what would happen if we widened the idea of text inside the notion of textual lineages. Interesting too is a lot of the boys really liked rereading. And it's such an interesting thing to me because in American schools, that's not something we privilege. And if there's something you could do to get yourself in trouble as a 7th grade teacher, let's say with the 8th grade teachers, it would be to teach an 8th grade book because they're going to come after you. But I've taught in Australia, and in Australia, they purposefully teach one of the same books year after year. I was in a high school where the same book was taught 4 years in a row. It was a Shakespeare play. But it was recognized that we learn to read by rereading. You know, much like Ron discussed with his parents, you know, rereading these poems. Jane Soulsby's research about emergent literacy shows that kids learn to read initially, to start to decode by rereading. And I wonder what would happen if we privileged a wider notion of text and we privileged a kind of rereading, because then every reading can be richer. You can be doing new things. I'm reading right now Harry Potter in German, and one of the things that's impressing me is that every book gets harder. It gets more rich, it gets more complex. And I think that the author can do that because you already know the characters, you already know the situation. And so it's almost like a rereading. So series books and rereading, I think, are things we should privilege as we help kids develop deeper expertise as literate beings.
Thank you, Dr. Wilhelm, and thank you, Dr. Tatum. I think that you are making both really important points here. There is a question that I'm going to ask Mario to read out loud because I think it's important for us to address it at this point. Mario, go ahead.
I wonder about the notion of hip hop pedagogy and the danger of reductive forms of using text in stereotypical ways based on assumptions about what Black males will enjoy. We invite any one of the panelists to expand on that.
This is often, I don't know, did you want to take a stab at it, Ron or Jeff, or you want me to just leap in?
Well, why don't you leap in, Doc, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, this is what I refer to as a sidebar conversation. It's almost as if we connect it to a historical equation of being 3/5 human. So oftentimes when we talk about what we should be sharing with Black boys, we look at it from a very narrow lens. Our history dictates that all text belong to all boys. The sciences, the social sciences. And so hip hop pedagogy in its variations and forms, if it's not connected to a deeper, broader agenda, self-determination, self-reliance, protecting yourself, protecting your community, and protecting your prosperity, it becomes an activity. Literacy is about having meaningful exchanges with text that regenerate equities over centuries. And no one genre has the power to do that.
Thank you. I think it goes back to the opening. Is it a shot? Is it an inoculation that is going to help me, right? Thank you very much.
And I don't tend to be the expert, but I do know that I'm much more appreciative because I think in Dr. Christopher Emdin, which many of you on the call probably follow or know about, talks about it in the 5 elements of hip hop. But see, I think what society has done is, when you think about the culture, you see the external, dress, attire. But you don't hear what Dr. Tatum just said. I think was powerful. All genre are open to utilizing for empowerment and enablement, and hip hop being one of them. So that's all I'll say. But Jeff, I don't know if you want to chime in.
Yeah, I do think that I agree totally with what Dr. Tatum said. Every genre is a specific mechanism that works in a particular way to explore particular topics and express particular themes and to lead to particular kinds of social actions. And so I think any genre can be very, very useful to kids. I've had experiences in my own life limiting kids, choices. And I think that it's never been a positive thing. And although this is a slightly different example, I was teaching in Australia, and there was a boy who was up at the book cart and he was looking through books. And I went up and I go, oh, here's a couple of books about surfing. So I was making this assumption. And he says, oh, okay. And I go, oh, I'm sorry, were you thinking of something else? He goes, yeah, I kind of wanted to read this book about the girl with cancer. And, it's just one of those many instances you see in your life where I made an assumption. I didn't ask him, tell me what you're interested in, tell me how I could support you. And, luckily he stood up for himself, but you wonder how many times a kid doesn't. So again, I'm really big on casting a wide net and widening our definition of text and what counts as literacy.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a nice segue for our next question, Ron.
Okay.
Well, Ron, can I say one other thing? It's going to be very brief. I don't want to interrupt the question.
Surely.
But I just want us to be aware that the pedagogy of hip hop pedagogy is an extension of the pedagogy of the drum.
Yes.
The African drum was about studying astrology and medicine and mathematics. Then you had the pedagogy of the blues. That was about studying sociology and society. Yeah. And then you had the pedagogy of jazz. That was about studying law and why we have criminal justice reform now. That came out of a movement of jazz and how marijuana took flight in the US government. And so I have to say, if we think about the pedagogy of, and we put it in a historical context, it has to be informed by the other disciplines. If we narrow the framing, we become inadvertent accomplices to failing our students. And this is why it becomes a taboo to talk about advanced literacy development. If it's not moving us toward advanced literacy development protection, it's a pedagogy that serves as an activity, but it's not a people-centric agenda that leads to self-affirmation, self-determination, self-reconciliation, et cetera, et cetera.
Well said.
Drop
well
the
said.
mic moment.
Yeah.
I told everybody moonshot thinking, right? Moonshot mindset. And I think this is the moment.
Sorry about that, Ron.
Mindset. So the question I'm going to pose, me might be a little bit, but I think it's connected, because I think both Jeff and Alfred have been alluding to what is the importance, really the necessary importance of not only having powerful text, but powerful instruction. And I know, Dr. Tatum, you have written about that, that you just can't have enabling text and expect it to be floating in air without having powerful instruction. So let's talk a little bit about that. Jeff, you want to start, and then Alfred will pick up.
I would absolutely love to. This is my deepest value, my deepest commitment, my deepest vision is to achieving educational equity. And the way I pursue it is through what's called inquiry-based teaching and learning. And I'd just like to point out that as a term of art in cognitive science, inquiry is the active apprenticeship and induction into expert practice. It's used in different ways, kind of in popular culture, but in cognitive science, it is apprenticeship into expert practice. Interestingly, John Hattie, in his famous review, Visible Learning, he rates inquiry kind of middling. And it's because he conflates inquiry as apprenticeship with discovery kinds of learning, which is not how cognitive science thinks about it. So what I'm talking about here is not discovery learning. It's this very active apprenticeship and very rigorous apprenticeship into transform ways of knowing, thinking, doing, and engaging. Inquiry always puts different text and perspectives into conversation, which is something Dr. Tatum has written about very, very compellingly. When we were doing our boys study, it was very interesting that the boys complained way more about school being too easy than that it was too hard. And when they complained about it being hard, they didn't complain about the hardness. They complained that they weren't getting the help they needed. And I already mentioned that so many of the kids were so impatient with the kind of instruction they were getting. They rejected it because they didn't see the purpose. They didn't see the payoff. They didn't see the rigor. They didn't see that they were getting the help they needed to outgrow themselves and to approach ever more closely ideas of expertise. One of my favorite quotes about this is one boy said, "It's like the teacher takes you out, throws you into a swimming pool, waits to see if you drown, and then marks it down in your grade book." And as we discussed this with him, he said, "I don't mind getting thrown in the pool, but why didn't you teach me to swim first? Or why didn't you throw me one of those donuts when you saw me struggling?" So the boys in our study, in no way, none of them rejected challenge. They wanted challenge, but they wanted assistance and help through the challenge. Now, when we talk about cognitive apprenticeship, one of the ways that I've used to express what cognitive apprenticeship is through this empower model. And it captures research from across the learning sciences and mirrors exactly how experts in all fields apprentice learners into expertise. So the first couple steps are really off stage. It's where the teacher's planning, where you envision your destination. What is the goal? And then you map it out, where you figure out, okay, what's the mental model of this thing I'm trying to teach, and what's the path to mastery, and how do I take the kids from where they are right now to where they need to be or where they would be more expert. Then you go on stage where you prime them for the journey. And this is where you activate and connect to the kids' personal lived through experience, but also to cultural relevance and cultural funds of knowledge. And then you orient them by highlighting the purposes and the payoffs to them, the community, the world, the environment of the learning that's going to be occurring. Then you do the walkthrough, which is really the crux move of apprenticeship, which is where you model and you mentor and you monitor and you assist the learners to understand what experts understand about the knowing, the thinking, the doing, the engaging. Then you get to the extension, the extend and explore, the new territory. And again, this is another place where the learners then apply what they've learned, where they exercise social agency and they apply to a problem that's compelling to them. And throughout the process, you're reflecting on the journey, naming what you know, what you're struggling with, what you want to know next. And this captures research from across the learning sciences. When you engage in this process, you're using the big picture planning to lay the foundation for a sequence of learning events that leads to enhanced capacity and transfer and new ways of knowing and doing things. So that's the process that we use. It's also a process that ARC uses that I think works for educational equity. I did want to mention one other thing, which is when you do this kind of inquiry, you are focused on what cognitive scientists call threshold knowledge. So threshold knowledge is a kind of knowledge that moves you through a gateway to a new way of thinking and knowing and doing that reflects expertise. And I think enabling text, as Dr. Tatum writes about them, are thresholds. You know, they take you through this gateway. Now, it's interesting that threshold knowledge, when it was originally being conceived of, was called troubling knowledge or troublesome knowledge. And I do think that this is the case with threshold knowledge, that it's always troubling. It's a core concept. It's a process that, once understood, transforms your perception and participation in a given topic or subject. And so it's not just troublesome, but it's transformative. It's irreversible. I'm thinking of ARC and their reading levels. If you get what you have to do at that reading level, kids never go back. They've gone through a gateway. And then, of course, there's another gateway to go through. It's integrative. It's bounded around a particular set of problems. It's discursive, so you can talk about it and explain it. And it's reconstitutive. Really, it changes your identity. It shifts your sense of self. So let me just give you an example. I've been engaged with ARC with a lot of the readings we've been doing. And we read How to Be an Anti-Racist. And early on in the book, Kendi makes this point that you can't say I'm not a racist because we live in a racist, oppressive culture. So you have to say I'm an anti-racist, because to say I'm not a racist is actually to collude. That was very troublesome to me as a white person of privilege. And once, I worked through the book and discussed it with some of my friends and thinking partners, it was a gateway to me. A gateway I'm still moving through. But it's just one example from my own life of an enabling text that took me through a gateway. I'll just conclude by saying Franz Kafka has this famous quote that a book must be the axe that smashes the frozen seas within us. That is what I think. We all have these frozen seas. We're unaware of them. They're the ways we have of thinking and talking and dealing with the world. And it's our existing schema. And we need books and we need experiences and we need teachers who are going to trouble us, change us, and transform us. And we need to be grateful whenever we're troubled and transformed in that way, because it gives us a chance to be something new and a better possible self.
Thank you. Dr. Tatum, the power of instruction.
This is the key, really. Reading can be and writing can be interrupted at the word level, the sentence level, the text level, the book level. And until we break down those barriers, our students rely on us to authorize or suggest what we put in front of them. There's a lot of talk about, so you have to provide quality instruction, or students will be forever dependent, or they will lose their confidence in reading, which was our first question. Dr. King, there's a lot of citing of Dr. King this past week, but he talked about two things: having a tender heart and a tough mind. A tender heart is, well, how we think about text. It connects us and it connects our humanity. When he talks about tough-mindedness, he was really talking about the ability to engage in serious self-study. At some point, students have to appropriate their own text for themselves. But if we're not providing powerful instruction, they lose the connection altogether. You have reading and writing, you have a severing of textual lineages. So it's not one or the other. So when I think about instruction in text, I often ask students to think about this. How do you measure your literacy? That's your reading and writing. And then how do you measure your life? Those are the texts that you're reading. So instruction in text is not just about measuring our literacy, but measuring our lives. And at some point, we have to have those self-measures. And we have to break down, whether it's at the word level, the sentence level, the paragraph level, etc.
So just before we open up for a couple of questions, there were so many important points that were made. Just to capture, if you're a king for a day, just for a day, both of you, and you want people to take something with them that will transform them, what would be what you would say to them? Don't forget this, because it can reshape the trajectory for yourself as a teacher and for the kids you serve.
So this is such an important question, and it's, of course, why we're doing the webinar. We want people to take something away that they can use. When the boys in our two studies, the Chevys and the Flow studies, rejected an assignment or a text, there were basically one of two reasons. One was they didn't see the purpose and payoff of engaging with it, or they didn't feel assured they would get the help they needed to be successful. And so I think these are the two major things for me: is how are we priming and orienting our instruction to connect to the lived through experience of our individual students and to highlight these are the purposes and payoffs for you. This is how you're going to develop agency in the world and agency for your community. And we also have to assure the kids, we're not giving up. We're here. We're going to do whatever we can to help you to learn. And I see it a lot in schools where, you know, there's a punt and the kids don't get the help they need. You know, I have a sign behind my desk that says, you will look bad before you look good. And when we start to struggle, I go, excellent. Now we can learn something, but we got to dig in, you know. Here's what I can do. What can you do? What do you need? You know, and just make that an object of conversation. You know, along those lines, I think what makes a text enabling is not just the text itself, though that's important, but the topic of conversation taken up around and with the text, how the text taught and used, what text they are put in conversation with, which is something Dr. Tatum writes about a lot, how they're remixed, how they are used, resisted, adapted, embraced, put into practice. So I think those are also things that we need to think about. Robert Coles in The Call Stories cites this patient of his who says, when I'm in trouble, I want Huck Finn to come into pitch. You know, that's what we want from these textual lineages and these enabling texts. We want them to come in and inform us when we're at these junctures of our life. Final comment I want to make is that when we were doing our follow-up study, going with the flow, and we were using guided inquiry environments and apprenticeship with the kids, the things previously rejected, like Romeo and Juliet, when we reframed it as a guided inquiry that connected to them, so exploring what makes and breaks relationships, they started to learn with what you'd have to call joy, you know, a kind of immersive joy. So again, it wasn't the text or the curriculum so much, but how it was approached and how it was used. And the more marginalized the learners were, the more obvious this joy was. And I do think we're at a moment right now in the history of education, in the history of our country, where there's an opening to change the way we teach and the way we think about teaching in ways that will give us joy as teachers, as well as give joy and develop the capacity of our learners. And so I so hope we grab this opportunity with both hands.
Thank you. Dr. Tatum?
This is probably the only time you're going to hear W.E.B. Du Bois and Judy Blume talked about in the same sentence. W.E. Du Bois wrote The Education of Black People. And he says, when a human being becomes suddenly conscious of their tremendous power, there is loosed upon the world possibilities of good that make men pause. That possibility of good resides inside of text. Judy Blume wrote, Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret. Both of those texts had a profound impact on me. Judy Blume and Margaret shaped the way I thanked and praised God. I would say, Are you there, God? And add my own name. But it was about the tremendous power that lies within. But the great fortune was I had access to both texts. And we have to guarantee that we make it difficult for young people to fail in our presence as we support them at the word level, the sentence level, the paragraph level, and the text level. So not only will they measure their literacy, they will be able to measure their lives.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you both. Before I turn over to Ron to show us a little bit of the beautiful book he wrote, I'm going to ask Mario, is there a question, Mario, that we want to present to our panel?
Yes. One comment in the chat that I'd like to share was a question around this idea of a wider notion of text. It reads, can a wider notion of text support the narrow notion of text found in our state testing, ACT, etc.? If so, what are the connections? Only as a hook to interest in further, more narrow approaches, such as close reading, or in deeper, more essential connections? We'd invite either Ron or Dr. Tatum to respond to that question.
Dr. Tatum, why don't you take it?
You beat me to it. I was going to defer to you. This really goes back to the measure of literacy. And so I think about it this way. And why I talk about language as tools of protection. If you have advanced literacy skills, you have rich vocabulary, you have wide range of experience, you know how to read and write and think across multiple texts, then testing doesn't become a barrier. And so if we think about a higher bar and think about that in relationship to what students are being asked to do, let's favor the higher bar and let the consequences fall where they may. Because at the end of the day, it's a snapshot in time, it has real consequences. But if we know who we are, we know where we come from, we're equipped with powerful language and knowledges, we'll be okay at the end of the day. It's only when we have literacy as a barrier do we succumb to some of the pernicious things that society puts in front of us.
Lots to think about and sleep on tonight. And with that, I'm gonna pass it on to Ron. And Ron is going to tell us a little bit about this book, and then he's gonna read us a couple of pages. Ron?
Thank you, Amelia, and thanks everybody, and definitely thank Dr. Tatum and Dr. Wilhelm for the wisdom they shared today. You know, as I told you earlier about the inoculation of a little black boy, vaccination of a black boy, and my mother was the one who went to school, high school, would have had aspirations to go into college, could not make it because she grew up in the Great Depression, as did my father. My father, who never went to school, but he had a plan because he appreciated the value of education. So, you know, I said, you know, let me start with my dad first, and really sort of share a little bit about his story and why the importance of he seeing through me, you know, this education. I was his pathway. You know, I was the headlight, not the tail light. And so, you know, I just remember all the stories, all the time we drive to work together. And so I'll open up by reading a little bit at the start of The Gift of Education by Solomon Walker. And you can see some of the photos there, and me in my cap and gown. So my father, Solomon Walker, could never read or write, but he knew the power of education. As a teenager, I saw him as the provider. He was the person who made sure our family had a roof over our heads, food on the table, and clothes on our backs. My mother was always the one who made sure my brother, sister, and I were doing well in school. It was my mom who came to school, met with teachers, and watched us play sports. Solomon always had a hunger for learning. Deep in his bones, this desire for education was the greatest gift he ever gave me. As I grew and matured, I realized that although my father was technically illiterate, he was in no way ignorant. So I'll go on a little bit, my father's childhood. When my father grew up in South Carolina in the 1920s, getting an education was not an easy thing to do, especially if you were poor and Black. The only school near his home was miles away. He lived with his grandmother, who was too poor to own a car, and there was no school bus. The only transportation was a horse, a mule, or your own 2 feet. My sister and I asked our father if he went to school. He said he did not have a way to get to school. Then we asked, Daddy, why didn't you just walk to school? With a big smile on his face, he said, I tried. The first time I walked to school, I was so late that the teacher told me to go back home. The next time I walked, I tried to get to school real early. All I found was a sign on the door. Although I couldn't read it, it meant that it was a holiday. That was the last time I went. So I jump a little bit, forward, and I'm gonna read just a page or two from the plan, Solomon's plan. When I was barely 14, out of the blue, like a genie from a lamp, my father asked me the question, son, do you want to go to college? I quickly said, yes, sir, I sure do. Without the crack of a smile on his face, he replied, well, I guess you will have to go to work with me. His plan for me began. I would work as a construction worker to earn the money to pay for college. The sun wasn't up yet when I had to wake up and put on his hand-me-down work clothes and old construction shoes covered in dried cement. I followed him to the job site where he tried to find a spot for me to work. Put him with us, said Ducky, a happy-looking Irish carpenter. I became Ducky's assistant, loading up materials for him. He also introduced me to Rev, a serious-faced black stonemason. These two men took me under their wings and turned me into a real construction worker. I worked shoulder to shoulder with them and other working class men every summer for the next 7 years. The hot and sweaty working conditions were made worse by stepping on nails and lifting heavy planks. I couldn't imagine doing this work my whole life. It was not what I wanted to be doing as an old man. These men were smart, creative, and highly skilled. While most of them barely completed high school, they all talked to me about the importance of getting a good education. I believe that is what my father wanted me to learn. He wanted me to earn the money I needed to go to college while appreciating the hard work that men without the same opportunities endured. Although some of the men had craft jobs, such as carpenters and masons, they were few in number. Without an education, I might have to work in construction my entire life. College would give me no choices for my future. When I received my paycheck, the same amount as Ducky and Rev, my father made sure that the first stop was the bank. Half of my pay went toward my college savings, and the half which was left went to my mother for household needs. Through this job, I learned a set of rules to live by. I learned that to build anything, I had to be a team player. If there was work to be done, I should do it without anybody needing to tell me to do it. I learned the value and importance of saving money and setting goals. By the time I was 19, my father trusted me enough as a responsible worker to lead me at the work site. Looking back, my father gave me two gifts. One was the opportunity to witness the life of a working man up close and personal. The second was the opportunity to earn enough money to go to college. With that education, all things became possible for me. I went to Lincoln University in Pennsylvania, the first college for Black men in the United States. I was able to follow the footsteps of two of my heroes who went to Lincoln University: Langston Hughes, the poet, the social activist, and Thurgood Marshall, the first African-American Supreme Court justice and the lawyer who won the landmark Brown versus Board of Education case. I went on to become a successful educator, a teacher, principal, and the founder of the Coalition of Schools Educating Boys of Color that works to connect, inspire, and enhance the potential of young men. Many times I heard my father say with pride, "That's my son. He is a teacher." I could tell that my father was satisfied in knowing that his plan had worked. Each day I see how much I am like my father. In my work as an educator, I try to convince and support young men and women who may not believe that they can become all that they want to become. My father, Solomon Walker, exceeded expectations. Although he was not able to attend school or learn to read or write, he's the smartest man I ever know.
Mm.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And before we go, there is an opportunity coming up that I would like for Dr. Tatum to talk about a little bit. And I think it's this week, right?
I believe it's on Monday. I get a
Okay.
chance to share the webinar with Dr. Nakia Hardy, and I think it's going to be a very engaging and thoughtful conversation.
Thank you so much for attending. Thank you for our panels. You have been wonderful sharing yourself, sharing your stories, sharing your texts. We will see you next time. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Ron, Jeff, thank you.
Take
Thank
care.
you.
Take care, Alfred and
Thank
Jeff.
you, Ron. Thank you,
Good
Dr.
seeing you.
Tatum.
Thank you,
Thank
Amelia. Thank you, support team.